She was 23 and she was sleeping in a stable. No family who would claim her, no wages owed to her that anyone would pay, just a tin locket at her throat and 4 shillings knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with those 4 shillings and that locket, Rose Turner walked out to the stall at the far end of the Ashcombe Hall stables, the one the horses would not enter, the one the grooms crossed themselves passing, and she made her bed there. But what nobody in the great house knew was that behind the warped boarding and the flaking plaster of that stall, hidden for 40 years, was a narrow door, and behind that door a sealed room, and inside that room the papers that would undo them all. Settle in, stay close to the lamplight, and before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, village, city, or country lane, and follow along, because this is a story that rewards patience. Rose Turner had come to Ashcombe Hall at 14, in the autumn of 1859, with a bundle of clothes tied in an apron and a character reference written in the careful hand of her aunt's neighbor, a Mrs. Emmeline Ray, who had been housekeeper at a rectory in the next parish for 31 years. Rose's father had been a wheelwright in a village called Marden, a broad, quiet man who died of a fever the winter Rose was 9, and her mother, who had taken in mending to keep the two of them fed, followed him within 18 months of the same complaint. There were no brothers. There were no sisters. There was an aunt in service in Bristol who could not take a child, and there was Mrs. Ray, who had loved Rose's mother like a younger sister, and who took the girl in and taught her, over 4 years, everything a woman without means might need to know to make herself useful in a great house. Mrs. Ray taught her to launder fine linen without scorching it, to turn a collar so the wear did not show, to render lard, to make a beef tea for a sick room, to write a clear hand, to keep a household account in double columns, to read a solicitor's letter and understand what was said in it and what was not. She taught her the names of herbs in the garden, and the names of the seams in a bodice, and the names of the tools in a kitchen, and she taught her, above all, to watch rooms, to watch people, to watch where things were put and where they were not. Rose was a quiet child and became a quiet young woman, and Mrs. Ray, who had buried a husband and 2 grown sons and lived alone in a whitewashed cottage with a coal range and a black cat, seemed to find in Rose a companion she had not expected in the last years of her life. When Rose was 13, Mrs. Ray had taken from her workbox a small tin locket, plain, no bigger than a shilling, with a fine engraved edging worn smooth by handling, and had pressed it into Rose's palm and said only, "My mother had it from her mother, and now you have it from me, and mind you don't lose it." Inside the locket was a curl of dark hair braided with a curl of gray, the 2 women Mrs. Ray had loved most before Rose came, and Rose had worn it under her collar every day since. Mrs. Ray died the following winter, quickly, in her own bed, and the neighbor's letter of character went with Rose to Ashcombe Hall, and Rose went into service there as an under-housemaid at £4 a year and her keep. Ashcombe Hall stood on a low rise of ground 3 miles from the market town of Meltbury, in a fold of the Cotswold country, a house of honey-colored stone with slate roofs blackened by lichen, and a long avenue of limes leading up to it. It had been in the Ashcombe family since the reign of the 2nd George, and in 1859 it was the property of one Mr. Edmund Ashcombe, a widower of 61, whose wife had died in childbed 20 years before, and whose only surviving child, a son called Julian, was then in his middle 20s and largely absent, keeping rooms in London and returning to the Hall only when his father's letters grew sharp about money. Mr. Ashcombe himself was a gentle, particular, melancholy man who kept early hours and read old books and walked the same 3 garden paths in the same order every morning of his life, and Rose, who was set first to the linen rooms and then to the still room, and at last, by the time she was 19, to the reading of accounts and the writing of household letters, became by slow degrees the person he trusted with the ordering of his days. She was not his housekeeper, Mrs. Bidwell held that place, but she was the one he asked for when a note wanted answering, or a shelf of books wanted dusting, or a page of the estate book wanted a second pair of eyes. She read to him in the last 2 years of his life, when his sight failed, sitting on a low stool by the fire in the library while he lay wrapped in a rug on the sofa, and she read to him from Cowper and from Boswell and from the parish register when he asked to hear the names of the dead. In September of 1868 he told her, without preamble, that he had made provision for her in his will, a small annuity, a room in the house if she wished it, and the tin box of his mother's letters, which he wished her to keep because no one else in the family would trouble to read them. He said it in the plain voice he used for household matters, and Rose thanked him in the same voice, and neither of them spoke of it again. He died in the middle of November, in the small hours, with Rose sitting by the fire in the next room. She was 23 years old. She had £4 saved in a stocking under her mattress and the tin locket at her throat and the memory of Mrs. Ray's voice saying, "Mind you don't lose it," and she believed, on the morning of Mr. Ashcombe's funeral, that she had a place in the world and a roof that would not be taken from her. She was wrong about that, as she would learn within the week, and the learning of it would begin in a room she had cleaned 100 times, with a solicitor she had served tea to, holding a paper he had not meant her to read. The solicitor was Mr. Harding of Harding and Peel of Meltbury, a narrow man of 50-odd years who wore a black frock coat that had gone shiny at the elbows and carried his papers in a green baize case with brass corners. He had handled the Ashcombe affairs for 19 years, and Rose had served him tea in the small parlor a dozen times, and he had always taken it with 2 lumps and thanked her by name. On the Tuesday after the funeral, he arrived at Ashcombe Hall at 10:30 in the morning. And Julian Ashcombe met him in the library, and Mrs. Bidwell showed him in and closed the door. Rose was in the passage outside with a tray of used cups from the breakfast room, and she heard through the door the low murmur of 2 men talking, and she went on to the still room and washed the cups and dried them and set them on the dresser. At 11, Mrs. Bidwell came to her and said Mr. Julian wished to see her in the library, and Rose smoothed her apron and went. The library was cold. The fire had not been lit. Julian Ashcombe stood at the window with his back to the room, and Mr. Harding sat at the small writing table with the green baize case open and a folded paper spread flat before him. Julian did not turn. Mr. Harding looked up at Rose and then down at the paper, and he said, in the voice he might have used to a tenant a quarter behind on rent, that Mr. Edmund Ashcombe's will, as executed and lodged in his office in June of 1866, made no provision whatever for a person by the name of Rose Turner. He said the estate, its lands, its house, its contents, and its residue passed in entirety to the only son and heir, Mr. Julian Ashcombe, as the will directed. He said that any later intentions the deceased might have expressed had not been set down in a codicil and had no standing in law. He folded the paper as he spoke and put it back into the baize case and closed the brass clasp with a small dry sound. Julian Ashcombe then turned from the window. He had his father's height and none of his father's stillness. He said that as the new master of Ashcombe Hall, he would be reducing the household considerably, and that Rose's services would not be required, and that he understood she had no family to return to, and would therefore be permitted to remain on the premises for 1 week while she found a place. He said it looking at a point above her left shoulder. He did not ask if she had questions. Mr. Harding kept his eyes on the baize case. Rose stood with her hands folded at her waist and said, "Thank you, sir," and she turned and left the room and closed the door behind her without letting the latch click. She went up to the small attic room she had slept in for 9 years, and she sat on the edge of the iron bedstead for perhaps 3 minutes, and then she stood up and took the stocking of coins from beneath the mattress and counted it. £4 and 2 shillings. She packed her clothes into the same apron bundle she had arrived with at 14, tied at the corners. She took nothing that was not hers. The tin box of Mrs. Ashcombe's letters, which she had believed for 2 months would be given to her, she left where it stood on the shelf above the washstand. She touched the tin locket at her throat once and left it under her collar. She went down the back stairs and out through the scullery door into the kitchen yard, and she carried her bundle in one hand and walked. She walked out of the kitchen yard and past the laundry and past the ice house and down the gravel path that ran between the yew hedge and the kitchen garden wall, and she came out at the lower gate onto the lane. It was a Tuesday in the third week of November, and the sky was low and even and gray, and the lane was rutted and greasy with the rain of the night before. She stood a moment at the gate and looked back at the honey-colored stone of the house through the bare limes and did not weep. She turned toward Meltbury because Meltbury was the only place she knew to turn toward, and she walked. The lane ran 3 miles to the town, between hedgerows of hawthorn and blackthorn set on the low, dry stone walls of the Cotswold country, and the fields on either side were stubble and mud and rooks. She had gone 1.5 miles before she understood she had no plan. She had thought, without thinking, of the market inn at Meltbury, and of asking for a place in service, and of writing to her aunt in Bristol, and she had thought of these things in the sequence of a person walking, and had not stopped at any one of them long enough to see it clearly. She stopped at the milestone at the parish boundary, and set her bundle down on the flat top of it, and looked at her hands. £4 and 2 shillings would keep her, at country prices, perhaps 6 weeks at an inn if she took the cheapest room and ate little. To find a new place in service, she needed a character, and her character had died with Mr. Edmund Ashcombe, because Julian would not write one, and Mrs. Bidwell would not defy Julian, and Mr. Harding would not commit himself to paper. Her aunt in Bristol, when last heard from 4 years before, had been in poor health and in a household that did not welcome letters. It was November, and dusk came at 4, and she had no roof for that night that she had paid for or been offered. She picked up her bundle and turned around. She walked back the 1.5 miles toward Ashcombe Hall in the failing afternoon, and did not go up to the house but along the field track that ran behind the paddocks, and came out at the far end of the stable yard, where the old timber block stood, the block that had not been used for the carriage horses in 10 years, and housed only 2 elderly hunters and a pony and the barn cat. The head groom was Mr. Josiah Barnes, a widower of 64, who had known Rose since she was 14, and who had once, when she was ill with a low fever in her 2nd year, brought her a jar of honey from his sister's bees. She found him in the tack room mending a rein, and she told him plainly what had happened at 11 that morning, and asked him if she might sleep in the stables until she had made a plan. Mr. Barnes laid the rein down across his knees and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Take the far stall, girl, the one nobody uses, and I'll say nothing to the house." He said, "There's clean straw in the loft and an old horse rug on the peg, and mind the door latches proper against the wind." The far stall stood at the north end of the old timber block, where the run of stalls met the gable end of the building, and the roof line dropped a foot lower than the rest, so that a tall man had to duck under the tie-beam as he stepped in. It was 10 feet deep and 7 feet wide, floored in worn oak planks laid over beaten earth, and its walls were of half-height plank boarding to shoulder height and rough lime plaster above that, plaster gone yellow with age and cracked in a webbing of fine lines like the glaze on an old teapot. The manger was a plain oak trough on iron brackets, split down its length and mended once with a strap of tin nailed across the split. The hay rack above it was iron, black with old grease, and one of its bars was missing. There was a ring bolted into the back wall for a head collar rope, and an iron hook higher up for a lantern, and the lantern hook had a dark stain of soot fanned out on the plaster above it in the shape of a candle flame. The stall door was a split door of soft old elm. The top half hung on strap hinges that had rusted through once and been mended with new iron. The bottom half worn smooth at the top edge by 50 years of horses leaning their chests against it. On the outer face of the door, someone had scratched the letter A and the year 1828 with a nail. The straw in the loft above was clean and smelled of dust and dry summer, and the horse rug on the peg by the door was a heavy plaid of brown and gray wool, worn thin at the folds and smelling faintly of neatsfoot oil and the animal that had last worn it. Rose spread the rug over a bed of straw shaken out along the back wall of the stall, hung her apron bundle on the lantern hook, and sat down on the rug with her back against the plaster to think. The horses in the other stalls, an elderly bay hunter named Perseus, and an older gray called Milton, and a pony whose name she did not know, shifted in the dark and blew softly through their noses, and she felt the warmth of them come along the row and settle in the beams. What Mr. Barnes had not said, and what she remembered as she sat, was that this stall had stood empty, not because it was inconvenient, but because no horse would stay in it. She had heard the grooms say so when she was 16. A colt put in there in her second year had kicked the boarding to splinters in a single night and been moved out at dawn. A quiet old mare had refused the door and stood in the yard in the rain rather than step over the sill. The grooms crossed themselves, passing the stall in winter dusk, and called it, without quite meaning it, the cold stall. And Mr. Barnes, who did not hold with talk of that kind, had simply stopped putting horses in it, and the stall had gone to broom and cobweb and the barn cat's kittens. Rose sat with her back to the plaster and listened to the timber creak in the wind and understood that she had been given the one place in the yard that nobody wanted and nobody would come to look for her in, which was for a woman turned out of a house at 11 that morning with a bundle in her hand as close to a gift as the day had offered. She ate a heel of bread she had wrapped in a corner of her handkerchief at breakfast, drank rainwater from the horse trough at the yard pump, said the Lord's Prayer under her breath as Mrs. Ray had taught her, and pulled the plaid rug up over her shoulders and lay down with her cheek on the straw. She slept and woke twice in the night to the horses shifting, and slept again and dreamed of the honey-colored stone of the house and of Mrs. Ray's kitchen with its coal range and the black cat on the settle. She woke at 6:30, before it was properly light, to the sound of Mr. Barnes drawing water at the pump and Perseus stamping in his stall. She folded the rug, shook the straw from her skirt, and stood in the doorway of the stall and looked at the walls in the gray light coming through the small window in the gable, and saw for the first time what she had lain against in the dark. The back wall of the stall, the plaster wall behind where her head had been, was not flush with the outer stone wall of the block. She had known the shape of the building from the outside for 9 years. She had passed it 100 times going to the kitchen garden and the ice house, and she knew the gable was a good 3 feet deeper on the outside than the depth of the stall on the inside. There was a space, then, between the plaster of the stall and the outer stone, and the plaster wall was not a wall in the true sense, but a partition, a shell of lath and lime hung on timber studs. And where the plaster met the corner post of the stall on the left-hand side, there was a hair's crack in the whitewash that ran floor to ceiling in a line too straight to be a settling crack. She stood a long moment and looked at it. Then she went out to the tack room and asked Mr. Barnes quietly for the loan of a chisel and a lantern. He gave her both without asking why, only said, "Mind the plaster comes off cleaner if you damp it first," and went back to his currycomb. Rose damped the crack with water from the pump on a rag, waited a quarter of an hour by the light of the lantern hung on the hook, and worked the chisel gently into the line. The plaster came away in a long, clean flake the length of her arm, and behind it was a strip of pine boarding an inch thick, painted once with a red-brown ochre now blackened by damp, and set into the boarding. Flush with its surface and hidden under 40 years of limewash and horse breath was the top hinge of a door. She worked for perhaps an hour. She took away the plaster in strips down the length of the crack and around the frame and uncovered a narrow door, 2 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall, hung on 3 strap hinges of hand-forged iron, closed with a plain iron latch, and locked with an old warded lock whose keyhole was clogged solid with dust and cobweb. The key was not in it. She cleaned the lock with a straw and a drop of oil from the tack-room can, and after a long, patient minute of working the latch with the point of the chisel, the bolt slid back. She lifted the latch, and the door opened toward her with a small dry sigh, and behind it was a room. The room was 6 feet deep and 7 wide, the full space between the stall partition and the outer stone. Its floor was flagged, its ceiling was the underside of the loft, and on its far wall, set into the stone, was a small iron-barred window painted over on the outside so that no light showed through into the yard. Against the left wall was a plain deal table 2 feet by 3, and on the table were a japanned tin box the size of a family Bible, a brass candlestick with a stump of candle in it, a stone inkwell dried to a black crust, and a small book bound in dark green cloth. Against the right wall was a single ladder-back chair. On the seat of the chair, folded and gray with dust, lay a woman's shawl of brown wool with a border of faded green embroidery. Rose set the lantern on the table, sat down slowly on the chair after lifting the shawl into her lap, and opened the tin box. Inside the box, laid neat as household linen, were 3 canvas bags, each tied with red string, a folded packet of banknotes wrapped in oiled paper, a small chamois pouch, and a long envelope of thick cream paper, sealed with a wafer of red wax and inscribed on its face, in a careful upright hand, with the words, "For whoever finds this." She untied the first canvas bag and poured its contents into her palm and counted sovereigns, 30 of them, gold and bright as the day they were struck. The second bag held 30 more. The third held 28.5 sovereign. The oiled packet held banknotes of the Gloucester and County Bank to the value of £40. The chamois pouch held a gold mourning ring set with a lock of pale hair under crystal, and beside the ring, wrapped in a scrap of blue silk, a small tin locket no bigger than a shilling, plain, with a fine engraved edging worn smooth by handling, the twin in every particular of the locket at her throat. She sat with the 2 lockets in her palm for a long time, before she broke the wax on the letter, and the green cloth book on the table she had not yet opened, and the papers folded flat beneath the tin box she had not yet seen, and the gray November light moved slowly across the flagged floor, and in the stalls beyond the plaster wall, Perseus stamped once and was still. The letter, when she broke the wafer and unfolded the single sheet of cream paper, was in the same careful upright hand as the inscription, and ran to a page and a little over. It began, "I am Hannah Ashcombe, born Hannah Ray, and I was the second wife of Mr. George Ashcombe of Ashcombe Hall, and I lived in this house from the spring of 1821 to the autumn of 1828, when I was put out of it by my husband's son by his first wife, without provision and without a character, in the 3rd year of my widowhood. I have made this room out of the old tack cupboard against the north gable, with the help of a joiner from Meltbury who is now dead, and who took my shilling and asked no questions. I have hidden here what I could carry away from the house before the son's solicitor came for the keys, and I have put by what I could out of the housekeeping over 7 years. I write this in the certain knowledge that I shall not come back to Ashcombe Hall. I write it for whoever finds this door, and I hope she is a woman, and I hope she is young, and I hope she has been used as I was used, and I hope this money and these papers will do for her what they cannot now do for me. My mother's name was Ray, and I had a sister, Emmeline, who married a clerk at the rectory at Marden, and if any child of hers comes to this house, I ask that she be told her aunt loved her without ever knowing her name." Rose read the letter twice through, and then a 3rd time, and then she laid it on the table beside the 2 lockets, and she sat with her hands flat on the deal boards and understood that Mrs. Emmeline Ray, who had buried a husband and 2 grown sons, and taken a wheelwright's orphan into a whitewashed cottage in Marden, had been the younger sister of the woman who had built this room, and that the tin locket at her throat and the tin locket in the chamois pouch had come from the same workbox in the same mother's hand 2 generations before. She did not weep. She folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and lifted the tin box off the table, and beneath it, folded flat as the letter had said they would be, were the papers Mr. Harding had not meant her to see. There were 3 of them. The first was a codicil to the will of Mr. Edmund Ashcombe, dated the 4th of September 1868, written in Mr. Edmund's own hand, signed by him, and witnessed by 2 names Rose knew, the vicar of the parish, Mr. Owen Prescott, and the estate carpenter, Mr. Thomas Ridley, providing to Rose Turner an annuity of £40 a year, the tenancy for her life of the South Lodge, and the tin box of the late Mrs. Ashcombe's letters. The second was a letter from Mr. Edmund to Mr. Harding, dated the same 4th of September, instructing him to lodge the codicil with the will in his office, and confirming to him that a copy had been placed for safety in the north stall of the old timber stable block, which had been Mr. Edmund's father's hiding place before him, and was known to no one now living but himself. The third was a receipted account from Harding and Peel of Meltbury, dated the 11th of November 1868, 4 days before Mr. Edmund's death, for the sum of £200, marked in Mr. Harding's own hand as paid by Mr. Julian Ashcombe, on account of the settlement of the estate. Rose sat with the 3 papers spread flat under the lantern for a quarter of an hour without moving, and then she folded them once, put them inside the green cloth book, put the book inside her apron bundle, closed the tin box, blew out the candle stump, took the lantern, and stepped back through the narrow door into the cold stall. She did not go to the house that morning. She went to the tack room and returned Mr. Barnes his chisel and his lantern and thanked him, and she asked him whether Mr. Thomas Ridley, the estate carpenter, was in the yard that day, and Mr. Barnes said he was at the sawpit behind the barn. Rose walked round to the sawpit and found Mr. Thomas Ridley, a broad-shouldered man of 58 in a leather apron, planing a length of ash for a gate. She asked him plainly whether he had witnessed a paper for Mr. Edmund Ashcombe in the library on the 4th of September. Mr. Ridley set down his plane, looked at her for a long minute, and said he had, and that the vicar had been the other hand, and that Mr. Edmund had asked them both to say nothing to Mr. Julian and nothing to Mr. Harding until called for. Rose asked whether he would say so to a magistrate. Mr. Ridley said he would say so to any man in England who asked him, and would say so under oath in the county court, and had wondered since the funeral why he had not been called. Rose thanked him, and walked the 3 miles into Meltbury that afternoon, with the green cloth book buttoned inside her bodice, and 4 shillings still knotted in her handkerchief, and she went not to the office of Harding and Peel, but to the office of Mr. Nathaniel Fenn, solicitor, of Church Street, who had handled the affairs of the rectory at Marden in Mrs. Ray's time, and who remembered Rose from an errand she had run for Mrs. Ray at the age of 12. Mr. Fenn was a stout, red-cheeked, patient man of 47 who wore spectacles on a black ribbon and kept his office in a room over a saddler's. He read the codicil, read the letter to Mr. Harding, read the receipted account, took off his spectacles, cleaned them on his handkerchief, put them on again, and said, without raising his voice, that he would ride out to the vicarage that evening and speak to Mr. Owen Prescott, and that he would file an application in the county court on Friday, and that Rose was to keep the papers about her person and speak of them to no one but himself and the vicar and Mr. Ridley. He charged her nothing that day and told her to come back on Friday and to eat a hot meal at the White Hart on his account in the meantime. Rose ate a plate of mutton stew and bread at the White Hart, sitting quietly by the window in her plain grey dress, and walked back to Ashcombe Hall in the last of the light, and slept in the cold stall on the brown and grey wool rug with the green cloth book under her cheek. On Friday, Mr. Fenn filed the codicil at the county court at Cirencester, with the sworn statements of Mr. Prescott the vicar, aged 62, and Mr. Ridley the carpenter, aged 58, appended to it, and on the following Tuesday, a summons was served upon Mr. Julian Ashcombe and upon Mr. Harding of Harding and Peel to appear and answer. In the 10 days between the filing and the hearing, Rose remained in the cold stall, and the yard began quietly, without any word being spoken, to look after her. Mrs. Sarah Pocket, the laundress, aged 51, a widow with 3 sons in the militia, brought a covered basin of hot broth and a wedge of pie to the tack room each evening at 6, and set it on the bench without speaking, and went away. Mr. Barnes drew Rose's water at the pump when he drew his own and left a full pail inside the stall door. Nan Hobbs, aged 19, the scullery maid, brought a clean linen shift and a pair of grey woolen stockings wrapped in brown paper and pushed them under the tack room door on a Sunday night. Mr. Ridley, without being asked, cut a plank to fit across the split lower door of the stall and hung it on a leather hinge so the wind off the north gable would not come in at Rose's feet, and he set a small iron brazier in the corner of the sealed room and pierced a length of tin pipe up through the loft and out through a slate to draw the smoke, so that Rose could have a coal fire without smoke showing at the stable door, and he did all this in an afternoon and did not send an account. The vicar, Mr. Prescott, walked out from the parsonage on the Thursday before the hearing, with a black umbrella over his arm and a small book of prayers in his pocket, and sat with Rose on the mounting block in the yard for half an hour, and told her that whatever the court decided he would stand by his signature, and that he had baptized her mother in Marden Church in 1822 and remembered her well. The hearing was on the second Wednesday in December at the county court at Cirencester in a room with green baize and gas jets before a magistrate named Colonel Wardle. Mr. Fenn spoke for Rose. Mr. Harding spoke for Mr. Julian Ashcombe. Mr. Prescott and Mr. Ridley gave their evidence plainly and without embellishment. The codicil, in Mr. Edmund Ashcombe's own hand and correctly witnessed, was admitted. The letter to Mr. Harding was read into the record. The receipted account for £200, marked paid by Mr. Julian on the 11th of November, 4 days before his father's death, was laid before the magistrate, and Mr. Harding was asked to account for it, and could not, and grew red in the face and silent, and Colonel Wardle looked at him for a long moment over the rim of his spectacles and said nothing. The codicil was ordered admitted to probate. Rose was granted her annuity of £40 a year, the tenancy for her life of the South Lodge of Ashcombe Hall, and the tin box of Mrs. Ashcombe's letters. Mr. Harding was referred to the Law Society for inquiry into his conduct, and within 3 months was struck from the roll of solicitors and left Meltbury for a sister's house in Worcester. Mr. Julian Ashcombe was not in court. He had sent Mr. Harding in his place, and on hearing the outcome by letter that evening, he took the London train the next morning and did not return to Ashcombe Hall for 2 years. Rose walked out of the county court beside Mr. Fenn into a thin December sun, and Mr. Fenn shook her hand and told her his account would come to £3 7s, which she could pay him at Lady Day, and she thanked him and walked to the Cirencester coach and rode back to Meltbury with the green cloth book buttoned inside her bodice, and £40 a year settled upon her for life. The South Lodge stood at the end of the Lime Avenue by the lower gate, a small square building of the same honey-colored stone as the house, with a slate roof, 2 rooms below and 2 above, a coal grate in each ground-floor room, a scullery lean-to at the back, and a strip of garden between the lodge and the lane. It had stood empty for 11 years since the death of the previous gatekeeper. The window frames had rotted at the sills, the slates were sound but green with moss, the plaster inside was flaking, and the grate in the kitchen was choked with jackdaws' nests. Rose moved into the lodge on the 20th of December with her apron bundle, the brown and gray wool rug, the 2 tin lockets, the green cloth book, and 88.5 sovereigns and £40 in banknotes sewn into a pocket beneath her petticoat. Mr. Ridley came the same afternoon with a bag of tools and a boy from the yard, and drew the jackdaws' nests out of the chimney, swept the flues, replaced 2 rotten window sills with new oak, and glazed a broken pane in the parlor with a piece of leaded glass he had saved from a chapel repair the year before. Mrs. Pocket walked down from the yard with a copper of hot water and a bar of yellow soap and a scrubbing brush, and she and Rose scrubbed the flagged floors of the 2 ground-floor rooms until the stone came up the color of new bread. Nan Hobbs came on the Sunday afternoon with a bundle of whitewash and a brush, and helped Rose lime the walls of the kitchen and the parlor in 3 coats, and stayed for tea. And by the end of that week the 2 downstairs rooms of the South Lodge were clean, white, warm, and dry, and Rose slept for the first time in 9 years in a bed that was her own. By Lady Day of 1869, Rose was known in Meltbury as Miss Turner of the South Lodge at Ashcombe Hall, and the small square building at the end of the Lime Avenue had a coal fire in the parlor grate every evening, a red geranium on the parlor window, a strip of kitchen garden dug over and planted with onions and winter kale, a black kitten from Mrs. Pocket's cat on the hearth, and the tin box of the late Mrs. Ashcombe's letters on a shelf above the parlor fire, delivered up by Mrs. Bidwell the housekeeper on the day after the court's decision, without a word spoken between them. Rose paid Mr. Fenn his £3 7s at Lady Day, and paid Mr. Ridley for the oak and the glazing, though he tried to refuse, and paid Mrs. Pocket for a week's laundry work at the going rate of 1 6d, and set aside £20 in the Gloucester and County Bank at Meltbury in her own name. On the mantel-shelf above the parlor grate, she set the 2 tin lockets side by side on a folded scrap of blue silk, and beside them the folded brown shawl with the green embroidered border, and above them, pinned to the whitewash with a brass pin, the letter that began, "I am Hannah Ashcombe, born Hannah Ray." She had a routine by the 2nd week in the lodge that did not change afterward. She rose at 6, laid the parlor fire, drew water from the pump at the lower gate, took her breakfast of tea and bread and dripping at the kitchen table, read a chapter of the Bible and a page of Cowper aloud to the kitten as Mrs. Ray had taught her, and walked out into the day. On Tuesdays she walked into Meltbury and took her bank book to Mr. Cadbury the clerk and drew what she needed for the week, and on Fridays she took a basket of eggs from the 2 hens Mr. Barnes had given her from his own yard down to the White Hart, where the innkeeper, Mr. Sylvester Bowen, aged 44, bought them at market price and stood her a cup of tea by the kitchen fire. On Sundays she walked up the Lime Avenue to the parish church and sat in the pew Mr. Prescott had shown her, 3 from the back on the north side, and after service she took tea at the parsonage with Mr. Prescott and his sister Miss Prescott, aged 58, who taught her to make a good household bread and gave her the receipt for it on a slip of paper in a copperplate hand. Miss Prescott, who had never married and who kept the parish register for her brother, took a slow, careful liking to Rose, and by Whitsun of 1869 was calling at the lodge on Wednesday afternoons with a piece of needlework and a pot of jam. On Wednesdays, therefore, Rose set out 2 cups and the small brown teapot Mrs. Pocket had given her out of her own kitchen, and the ritual of Wednesday tea in the parlor of the South Lodge established itself and continued unbroken for 11 years afterward. Rose let it be known in Meltbury quietly, by way of Mr. Fenn and Miss Prescott, that she would read a solicitor's letter for any woman in the parish who could not read one for herself, and would write a plain answer to it, and would take no fee for the work. Within 3 months she was reading letters at her kitchen table on Thursday afternoons for tenant widows and cottagers' daughters, and by the summer of 1869 she had helped Mrs. Alice Beddoe of Lower Marden, age 61, secure a widow's annuity that a nephew had tried to withhold from her, and helped Kate Purvis, age 20, the daughter of a drover, get her promised wages of £8 out of a farmer at Dursley who had thought a drover's daughter would not press him. Word went round the parish, and up into the next parish, and down into Meltbury, that Miss Turner at the South Lodge knew what a paper meant, and would say so plain, and would not tell a woman's business at the White Hart afterward. Mr. Fenn came out to the lodge one Sunday afternoon in July, looked over her Thursday papers, drank 2 cups of tea, and said she was doing the work of a country solicitor's clerk without pay, and might as well take a shilling for each letter she read, so that people would value what she gave them. And Rose, after some thought, took his advice and set her fee at 1 shilling a letter, and the shillings went into a japanned tin on the parlor shelf and were spent, at the end of each quarter, on coal for the widow Beddoe and on flannel for the drover's children in Meltbury workhouse. By the harvest of 1869, the South Lodge at Ashcombe Hall was a small, warm, functioning place at the end of the Lime Avenue that people in 3 parishes knew how to find, and Rose Turner, aged 24, was Miss Turner of the South Lodge, and no one in Meltbury or Marden or Lower Dursley called her anything else. On a still evening in November of 1869, 1 year to the day from Mr. Edmund Ashcombe's funeral, Rose sat by the parlor fire in the South Lodge with the black cat on her knee and the tin box of Mrs. Ashcombe's letters open on the small deal table at her elbow. The coal in the grate was steady and low. On the mantel shelf above her, the 2 tin lockets lay side by side on their folded scrap of blue silk, the one Mrs. Emmeline Ray had given her at 13, and the one Hannah Ashcombe had left in the chamois pouch in the sealed room, and beside them the brown wool shawl with the faded green embroidered border was folded small, and above them the letter beginning, "I am Hannah Ashcombe, born Hannah Ray," was pinned to the whitewash with a brass pin so that the careful upright hand could be read from the chair by the fire. Rose thought, without heat and without triumph, of the library on the Tuesday morning a year before, of Mr. Harding's shiny elbows and Mr. Julian at the window, of the paper folded back into the green baize case, of the walk to the milestone and the walk back, of Mr. Barnes laying the rein across his knees in the tack room, of the hair's crack in the whitewash of the cold stall, of the chisel and the damp rag and the bolt sliding back, and of 2 tin lockets in her palm under a lantern. She thought of Mrs. Ray in the whitewashed cottage at Marden with the coal range and the black cat on the settle, who had loved a wheelwright's orphan and taught her to read a solicitor's letter, and of Hannah Ashcombe, put out of this same house in 1828 without provision and without a character, who had sat in a room 6 feet by 7 and written for a woman she would never see. 2 women a generation apart, sisters by blood and strangers to Rose in life, had between them set aside what they could, one a tin locket and a lesson in double-column accounts, the other 88.5 sovereigns and a letter, and both had reached her. Rose was 24, and she was sitting in her own parlor, and the kettle on the hob was hers, and the geranium on the sill was hers, and the shilling tin on the shelf was hers, and outside the window the lime avenue ran up to a house that had turned her out one Tuesday morning in November, and now sent Mrs. Bidwell down the lane at Michaelmas with a civil note about the pheasants. Rose Turner had been 23 and turned out of a manor house with 4 shillings in a handkerchief and a tin locket at her throat, and she had gone to the one stall in the yard that nobody wanted and made her bed there, and it had been the best 4 shillings and the best tin locket she ever carried. What had begun as a woman with no roof had become a woman at whose door other women knocked on Thursday afternoons with papers they could not read, and the cold stall at the north end of the old timber block, whitewashed now and used again for a quiet mare of Mr. Barnes's, was only a stall, and the narrow door behind its plaster stood open to an empty room, because everything that had been hidden in it was on the mantel shelf of the south lodge, in the light of the fire, where Rose could see it from her chair. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and to share it with someone who has been quietly counted out and gone on working anyway, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, whether it is a lamplit kitchen in the north of England or a porch on the other side of the world. And before you go, sit with this question a little while. What has someone left for you, in words, or in small careful objects, or in a lesson taught at a kitchen table, that you have carried without quite knowing its worth, and who, in your own quiet way, are you leaving something for now?